for joining us, and welcome to the first webinar of our series. A wake-up call for climate justice, Indigenous knowledges respond to the coronavirus pandemic. My name is Silvia Cifuentes, and I am a graduate student in the Department of Global Studies at UCSB. Today, we're kicking off the series with a keynote address by Professor Dina Gilio-Whitaker, entitled Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Justice in a Pandemic-Prone World. This series of global dialogues will further feature Indigenous leaders, traditional healers, scholars, and allied scholars from India, Amazonia, and California. We will explore and analyze two feedback loops. The first among climate injustice, fossil fuel extraction, ecosystem vitality, and the impacts on Indigenous communities, on the one hand. And the second one among Indigenous ecological knowledge, health inequity, and pandemic responses grounded in Indigenous knowledges, including traditional medicines on the other. Through these webinars, we seek to highlight and explore the range of creative Indigenous responses to COVID-19, to better understand how Indigenous communities have centered ethics of communal care, landscape relations, and Indigenous knowledges in charting pathways toward preventing COVID-19 and making communities strong. We will also critically examine the framework of resilience, which is ubiquitous in scholarly literature and media descriptions of Indigenous COVID-19 coping mechanisms, but is often applied with a colonialist lens that further denies Indigenous agency in asserting local responses. So my teammate, Alexander Carvelos, will now continue with a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. UC Santa Barbara's campus and the surrounding communities of Isla Vista, Goleta, and the greater Santa Barbara area are located on the unceded Indigenous lands and waters of the Chumash people, the traditional and expert stewards of this region. UCSB specifically is built upon several village sites that have always been centers of learning, research, and knowledge generation, places of coming together and exchange for the coastal band of the Chumash Nation, as well as other Chumash communities and a vast network of Indigenous peoples. I extend my gratitude personally to coastal Chumash community leader Mia Lopez for sharing this information with me and for sharing the names and stories and gifts of her ancestral lands with the campus community. In this acknowledgement is also an acknowledgement of the need for the campus community to listen to Chumash and other Indigenous voices with a respectful and reciprocal ear, recognizing that the establishment of the university is predicated upon the exclusion and violent erasure of these Indigenous peoples and their knowledges. Settler colonialism is, of course, not a past event, but an ongoing process. And we are gathering within the virtual domain of an institution that is complicit in this process. This land acknowledgement then is also an acknowledgement of our responsibility as researchers and scholar activists to create spaces within this colonial institution that can provide real support, relational, political, and economic, for Indigenous people who are working to empower their communities and to reclaim stolen lands. We acknowledge and stand in solidarity with Chumash and allied land defenders confronting colonial encroachments in the grasslands of the San Marcos foothills, on the forested slopes of Mount Pinos, and in many other places. And we intend for our gathering here today to aid and contribute to their efforts. Land acknowledgement is a relational act and acknowledging not just the lands we are on, but also our individual and collective relationships and responsibilities to them. As a settler-descended scholar, I think of the lands that have nurtured me from my birth as an uninvited guest in Pomo and Coast Miwok territory, Sonoma County, where I'm calling from right now, and my charge to listen humbly to these lands and the Indigenous leadership here. We are attending this event from many different places, and wherever we are on someone's ancestral lands, perhaps our own, and most likely, and for many of us, we're on someone else's ancestral lands. So I invite us all to hold a moment of silent reflection now to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands that each of us are now on, and to reflect on our own relationships and responsibilities to those lands and their Indigenous communities. So just, we can put our thoughts there for just a brief moment. Okay, thank you. We are grateful for all of you who are joining us. Welcome. And I will now turn it over to Julia, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Alexander, for the land acknowledgement. It is my great honor to introduce Dina Gilio-Whitaker. She is a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes, a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and an independent educator in American Indian environmental policy and other issues. At CSU San Marcos, she teaches courses on environmentalism and American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women's activism, American Indians and sports, and decolonization. She also works within the field of critical sports studies, examining the intersections of indigeneity and surfing. As a public intellectual, Dina brings her scholarship into focus as an award-winning journalist as well, contributing to numerous online outlets, including Indian Country Today, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, and many more. Dina is the author of 2 books, including the award-winning As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. She is currently under contract with Beacon Press for a new book under the working title, Illegitimate Nation, Privilege, Race, and Accountability in the US and Other States. We're deeply honored and humbled to be hosting Dina and grateful for her willingness to provide a keynote address in opening our webinar series. Please join us in our warm welcome.
Lemlem for that, Julia. And why Pisnak Siok, Squeeze Dina Gilio-Whitaker. And I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Ohashiman Nation in what's currently called Orange County in Southern California. And I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington State. And as I've a practice that I'm used to doing now is introducing myself in the way that I would introduce myself if I were in the, back home on the reservation with that community. I would tell you that I am the daughter of Rosemary Burnett Gilio, the granddaughter of Mabel Dizitel, and the great-granddaughter of Ida O'Brien Dizitel and Gilbert Dizitel. And that way I establish my my kinship to that community and my accountability to that community as well as a Native person. So let's see. That said, I think that's pretty much all I want to say before I share my screen and talk to you about what I want to talk to you about today. Let's see here. Let me change that. Let's go to, let's see. Okay, yeah, so this is, I wanted to share with you this talk. This is, I've given a couple of different versions of this talk a few times now in the last year. COVID certainly changed our world in the last year to year and a half, and it brought quite a few things into sharp relief for us, and bringing all of those things together in this conversation in ways that will might seem a little disjointed at first, but I ask you to bear with me, and it all comes together at the end. These are the connections are clear, but making the connections can be can feel a little kind of jumpy. So, but we will get there. So the conversation that I'm having is, that I enter into this conversation from the perspective of environmental justice. My current work, or the current book that's out right now, As Long as Grass Grows, of course, does that work. In that book, I brought a very different perspective on environmental justice as as an intervention into the literature, into the environmental justice discourse, which, as we talk about it, is really about theory, it's about activism and policy and law. And the reason that I come to that conversation was because I'd been studying environmental justice since I had been an undergrad. And as somebody in American Indian Studies, I could see very clearly that what I knew about American Indian Studies and colonialism and that which frames the lives of Native people in the US really didn't match up with the way that environmental justice gets spoken about in the literature. And the reason was because it focused on this concept of environmental racism as the analytic that describes these processes of injustice for communities of color, predominantly in poor communities. And in this framework of environmental justice, it posits the redistribution of environmental risk and harm under that framework of environmental racism. But what I came to realize was that it did not account for the very different experience of American Indian people as people who have undergone colonization, who have undergone genocide and land theft and ecocide. Ecocide, of course, being that processes that are about the destruction of ecosystems in ways that are fundamentally genocidal for American Indian people. So environmental justice, as I had been exposed to it, did not take any of those things into consideration. As I have grown more and more aware, this idea of racism is really as that analytic of the kind of the foundational injustice in the United States is not a big enough framework to understand the experience of settler colonialism and the structure of settler colonialism in the US. And I would argue, because we are in this webinar series, we are covering Indigenous issues that are more global in scale. Although my work as an Indigenous and American Indian scholar is specifically in American Indian Studies, I think that what I know about global Indigenous issues is that many of these principles that I'm speaking about now are applicable in a great many other national contexts. So, so while settler colonialism is that really specific framework that we apply to the U.S. context, I think that there's a growing recognition of settler colonialism as an analytic that also applies in other areas, in other parts of the world, and so much of this language will translate and will make sense in other contexts. And so some of those things that we can talk about what settler colonialism does in its project to eliminate Indigenous populations in order to replace, because that's how we understand settler colonialism, as something that's not something that happens just in the past or as something that ends. It reproduces itself ongoingly in these structures of domination. And part of what that does is that it constructs Indigenous peoples as inferior to dominant societies. These are projects of social Darwinism and what's been called scientific racism. And these are, of course, narratives about human civilization and, you know, the hierarchical nature of that. About, you know, there's of course, we're all familiar with this in this framework. There's a pinnacle of civilization, and that's expressed through European cultures who who think of themselves as ultimately superior, and because they're so cultured and they have the right religion and the right everything and the right skin color. And then other types of people, of course, are below, somewhere below that in this triangle or this hierarchical understanding of human civilizations. And so indigenous peoples are pretty far down there at the bottom. And of course, this goes back to, we can trace this back to as far as the Crusades, actually. And because it's a religious project, it comes out of the Roman Catholic Church in its centuries of European expansion and early globalism. And it really gets encoded into and articulated as the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery begins as the papal bulls that are, these laws created by the Catholic popes that fundamentally were about justifying the elimination of indigenous populations in order to take the land. So it's about justifying the violent imposition and taking of land from indigenous people. Certainly the doctrine of discovery is the basis of American law, starting with the 1823 decision of Justice John Marshall in the Johnson v. McIntosh decision, Supreme Court decision. And then it gets further entrenched with other kinds of legal doctrines that maintain this indigenous inferiority. And we also see the doctrine of discovery in other places. It's certainly part of Canadian law. It's part of Australian law and New Zealand law. So these are all these particular countries are what we call the Kansas nations. In the international arena, like in the United Nations, that's the acronym, the Kansas nations. These are the 4 largest settler colonial states. But we also see other versions of this inferiorizing of indigenous peoples in other places. And here I'm thinking about the backwards tribes of India in the caste system. And also in Latin America, we can recognize it in narratives of mestizaje, which is a narrative of intermarriage and intermixing of the races that elevates indigenous people to this higher level of civilization. And so in the inferiorization of indigenous peoples, the results of all of this is the countless myths about indigenous people that constantly reinforce these relationships of domination around superiority and inferiority. And part of that, certainly in the United States, we can talk about this, is that the move to justify this violent dispossession of land is this myth that indigenous people, or it's really a lie, that indigenous people didn't know how to use land properly because they weren't using land according to European standards. And so this is, one of the things that is about legitimizing, this violent foreign takeover of indigenous lands. And so Europeans and other colonizers really couldn't, because of that, because they saw themselves as so superior, they couldn't recognize the actual sustainability of indigenous societies and how they lived on their lands and why they were able to live on within very particular ecosystems for thousands and thousands of years without killing themselves, right? Or killing their environments, or committing ecocide on themselves. So this is where we, now we're at a moment in time where we're starting to have a kind of a reckoning about this. And I think climate change is one of the things that's bringing this to the surface. So bringing us to that conversation of climate change and climate justice. So so climate justice is a subset of environmental justice. So when we talk about climate justice, of course, it's really not a separate conversation. It's it comes out of the environmental justice movement and conversation, which really is only, environmental justice is a discourse that begins, of course, as activism, in the United States, in disenfranchised, or, well, not disenfranchised, but communities in the South who, perceive themselves as being targeted for, toxic waste development, and that leads to this idea of environmental racism, that they are being environmental or racially targeted in this environmentally particular way. So we have to understand climate justice as part of this larger movement for environmental justice in racialized and otherwise marginalized communities. But with regard to Indigenous peoples, we know that Indigenous peoples, and this is becoming more and more accepted and known in climate justice, in the world of climate justice, that Indigenous peoples are, experience disproportionate impacts from climate change. And if we understand the context of that, we know that Indigenous peoples occupy 24% of land worldwide. And within those lands, they control 80% of the biodiversity. So this, the recognition of this is beginning to dawn on people as we see our climate change and environmental degradation really being the driver of this, or hugely connected to it, and the critical importance of Indigenous people on the land, looking after these biodiverse areas that we finally are seeing that need to be preserved. And at the same time, Indigenous peoples are vulnerable to exploitative land use through mining and other extractive processes that are fundamentally, exploitive. They are fundamentally damaging to the earth in all kinds of ways that we all are very well aware of. And at the same time, in these climate justice movements, Native people have been systematically sidelined in these global responses to climate change. And here we can think of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accords, which of course the Paris Accords come out of the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, the Kyoto Protocol went down in flames. It was a complete failure. And there's a big conversation about that, about why that was. But one of the problems with the Kyoto Protocol from an Indigenous perspective was that they completely ignored Indigenous people, because it's a state-centered process, and it left Indigenous peoples to be in the purview of states who already were exposing them to abusive practices, which still go on to this day in things like predatory conservation, right? So there's more and more knowledge about these, national conservation projects that are that in the long run end up removing Indigenous peoples from these lands in the name of preservation and conservation of forests and other kinds of natural resources, in the name of, guarding against climate change. And at the same time, Indigenous peoples are vulnerable to the change, to climate change, to the ways that the earth are changing, when things like sea level rise and the change in weather patterns, and the increasing loss of access to important cultural and physical resources that really define Indigenous life. And so we can understand climate change, and the way that Indigenous scholars are writing about this increasingly is, and I'm quoting Kyle White here. Kyle White, talks about climate change being intensified colonialism. So we have climate change because of the colonial, extractive, capitalist system that has been made possible through 500 years of violent colonial expansion on a global scale. And so we can also connect it to the indigenous eradication, so the ways that Native people lived on the earth, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, that led to another process of another genocidal process that we can call epistemicide, or the killing of indigenous knowledge systems. And this is a conversation, this idea of epistemicide is something that you see. It's an analysis that you see more commonly coming out of Latin America, but it's a term that's becoming a little bit more engaged in the settler colonial context in North America or Turtle Island in the U.S. And I think that because it makes so much sense, it's exactly what happened here, especially if we think back on to the policies of forced assimilation, the boarding school era, with the prohibiting of indigenous languages, and the violent imposing of white culture on Native people as a part of this disappearance, this project to disappear Native peoples. So an example of the way that indigenous people are, in the US being exposed to greater risk of climate change is in this image here, which is the village of Tahola on the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington State. This is the largest of the Quinault villages. The Quinaults they know that this village is, because you can see how it's just so at sea level. By projecting the climate, sea level rise, they know that they're going to lose this village, and so they are already in the planning stages of moving this village because it will no longer be habitable in the near future. So we saw in that video the clear connection between indigenous knowledge and the way Native people understand themselves as connected to land and place. He says that without the bear and the eagle and the salmon, we don't even exist. Right? That's how deep this is, and this is a very, very common experience of indigenous peoples all over the world. And so this is a very different relationship to land compared to the modern state system in which capitalism and private property are what structures societies, versus these values of relationality, which is really the core of indigenous people's relationship to land and thus their systems of knowledge. And so when we talk about this very different orientation to the world, we can talk about this, and this is often how we teach about it on our campus at San Marcos. We incorporate these values into how we work with students and how we encourage them to bring these values to everything that they do. And we refer to the 4 R's, or sometimes the 5 R's, and the 4 R's begin with relationality and reciprocity, which leads to responsibility and respect. And also sometimes we can talk about reverence as a 5th R. When you live in a worldview that understands, your relationship to the natural world, and your reciprocity with it, then you automatically have a relationship of responsibility and respect for those you consider yourselves related to, the more than human, your more than human relatives in the natural world. And so we talk about TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, of course, as one type of Indigenous knowledge. There are many types of Indigenous knowledge. There are many types of TEKs, because TEK is not monolithic. There are commonalities, but it's not universal. It's not monolithic. And it's always constructed by language and by the relationships to these very particular ecosystems that Indigenous peoples understand themselves as emerging from. And so these are fundamentally these are knowledge systems that are based on philosophies and approaches to the world, and these are always intertwined. They are you know, inextricably connected. And you know, we can see some examples of Indigenous knowledge at work here in the top image here, which is a fish pond in Hawaii. This is part of what's happening with Native Hawaiian Kanaka people, is the revitalizing of these ancient fish pond ecosystems. And here in California, of course, we know the revitalization of cultural burning, you know, under the view that fire is medicine on the land, as Native Californians say. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears again here for a second, and I want to talk about something that I became aware of, this field of study I was not aware of until a year and a half ago, when COVID hit us. And I didn't know that this field of study called planetary health actually existed. So I started digging into it to find out what it is. And I learned that it's a field of study. It's pretty new. It really only comes about a beginning in about 2015. So not even a decade old. It's, you know, 5-6 years old. And it comes as a result of a project between the Rockefeller Foundation and the Lancet Medical Journal. And what they do is they come together. There's a wide variety. It's highly interdisciplinary. And it brings together experts in environmental studies, like environmental health, biodiversity, ecology studies, medicine, epidemiology, zoonotics, virology. So pretty wide range of sciences there. And they had this conference in 2015, and they produced a white paper. And this image here is just a glance at what that white paper was. This is the title of that white paper, Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch. This report of the Rockefeller and Lancet Commission on Planetary Health. And they identified that we're at a global tipping point now, and that tipping point refers to the first time in the modern world where human life expectancy is going down because of the interconnections between the ill health of the planet, of, you know, environmental degradation and climate change, and relating that to how that's impacting human health. So that's really what this field does. It brings these two things together in a very particular way. And the conclusion that this paper, this white paper, comes to is the failures, 3 different kinds of failures. There's failures of imagination, knowledge, and governance, which includes the over-reliance on economics as a measure of human progress. So they come out, they don't explicitly say capitalism, but they do sort of lean in that direction by understanding economics as certainly being there's a failure here because of this, the overstated importance of human progress and economics tied to that. So this is really, really interesting. A failure of knowledge. This is what caught my attention here. And I began digging into some of the research of planetary health. I discovered that there's an entire alliance, the Planetary Health Alliance. It's now housed at Harvard University, and they have archives of hundreds, a growing archive of hundreds of research papers from all these various disciplines addressing these issues. And so I scoured the archives to see, is there a conversation for Indigenous knowledge in there? Are Indigenous peoples represented in that literature? And there was almost nothing. There was almost nothing talking about Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous ways of knowing. It was almost completely absent. And so that's what got me to thinking about how do we insert our Indigenous worldviews into conversations like this? And so I ended up writing an article about it that was published in High Country News, talking about the fact that Indigenous knowledge has got to be part of how we imagine a sustainable future in the face of here in the Anthropocene epoch. And so that brings us to this conversation about pandemics. Of course, because COVID is what really brings all of this conversation, to the surface. And it was so shocking because nobody was expecting it. Well, at least most regular people. That opens up to a whole other conversation about who was expecting it and what they were expecting, but I'll get to that in a second. Yeah, which is, yes, this idea that epidemiologists have been predicting some kind of global pandemic event for decades. And we've seen pandemic events over the past, several decades. We've seen AIDS, the AIDS epidemic. We've seen multiple kinds of influenza viruses, the H1N1 virus, the swine flus, and the avian flus. And of course, now we've seen these SARS viruses, these coronaviruses. And what I came to find out is that even though these epidemiologists have been predicting predicting these pandemics, and they've been predicting a big one, kind of like the big earthquake we're always hearing about here in California. But that the SARS-2 was not the big one that they were expecting. They have been thinking that it's going to be an influenza virus that would, be on the scale of the 1918 influenza pandemic, and which would be more deadly even than the COVID virus as a coronavirus. And for Native people, it's really scary. It brings up some pretty bad memories because we know all about pandemics. If you're Native, any Native people, we all know these stories about the mass death in our own communities, sometimes not very long ago. Of course, it began with the arrival of Europeans in the 1600s, especially, and we're familiar with that. For the Pilgrims, for example, when they first came, the Mayflower Pilgrims came upon villages that had only recently experienced massive a disease event where their their villages were almost completely wiped out. Squanto, if we think of that Thanksgiving story, Squanto, of course, was the sole survivor of I think his people were Patuxet people. And so we've all heard these stories, but for Native people, we've lived it. We know these stories even in our own families, and so we can see a trajectory of foreign disease intersecting with these processes of ecocide, right? The killing of ecosystems, or the interjection of these ecocidal processes that are fundamentally genocidal for Native people, and that leads to these systems of epistemicide, the killing of indigenous knowledge systems. So it's a through line. It's a trajectory in which all of these things connect in some kind of way. And so in terms of the failure of knowledge that planetary health, that white paper identified, from my perspective, I think that we can talk about the Anthropocene, and from the ways that other American Indian scholars and probably Indigenous scholars in other places understand the anthropocentric nature of the epistemological frameworks that have actually brought us to this place. That is Western knowledge, like the Western, capitalist, heteropatriarchal, colonial Western world that we all are defined by these days, and it's that which brings us to this point of sixth mass extinction, of extractive economies, of unfettered capitalism. All of that is, what brings us to this tipping point that the planetary health studies identified. So how do we connect all of this together? This is what I've been thinking about a lot. And so I kind of identified sort of a formula. If we think about environmental degradation leads to climate change, or is inextricably linked to climate change and pandemics. So that's like an equation. And at the same time, we see social and economic injustice, systems of social systems of humans, disproportionately affecting people of color, who experience greater vulnerability to pandemics and climate change. And so as I was preparing for this talk over the last several weeks, as luck would have it, I received a message from somebody asking me if I would review this forthcoming book, this written by Stan Cox. And Stan, I saw you in the participants list. I'm glad that you're here. Stan Cox is a scientist who has written numerous books around climate change and other kinds of environmentally related issues. And so this is his forthcoming book about the path to a livable future. And lo and behold, he's brings all of these things that I've been thinking about together in a way that I thought was really cohesive and really clear. And so I want to highlight some of the points that he makes in this book, because I think it really brought it together in a way that made sense to me, and that was easily digestible and easily communicable. And so I did my own research, and I, looking at the relative to the pandemic, the actual statistics of how people of color have been impacted by COVID. And the CDC reports that American Indians, that of course American Indians, Black, Hispanic, and Asian American communities are, were significantly at higher risk for COVID in a number of different categories, like, the rates of hospitalization, rates of infection, and rates of death. For American Indian populations, American Indians were 3.5 times more. This is compared to white populations, the white dominant society. American Indians are 3.5 times higher rates of hospitalization. They died at 2.4 times the rate of white dominant society, and they had an infection rate of 1.6 times that population. And one of the things that Stan does in this book is to point out about the redlining of Black community. These are examples. I'm cherry picking now from some of the statistics that he highlighted in this book about how the redlined Black communities and their exposure to the impacts of climate change are in these redlined communities, which are always urban jungles. These are concrete intensive communities that are typically 5 to 12 degrees hotter than other areas because they have less vegetation. They're so concrete intensive. Another way that communities of color experience this disproportionate impacts of climate change and COVID, and this was really shocking to me. 9,000 with farm workers, over 9,000 people died from COVID in 2020 alone, and when we're talking about farm worker populations, we can also talk about the ways that farm workers are, of course, overwhelmingly Hispanic. This is connected to how climate immigration from Central America. People are immigrating from Central America, even to the United States, even in the Trump years when it was really dangerous to make those migrations because of the way that climate change is making life impossible for those populations down there, and that combined with the political intensity as well. For American Indian populations and around climate change, the scholar Daniel Wildcat has been really clear in a book that he wrote several years ago now called Red Alert, and he talks about climate change becoming a new form of removal for Native people, the fourth removal, he calls it. So, on top of the expulsion from their homelands, like with the Trail of Tears, the removal of children from their homes, sending them to boarding schools, all the cultural removal, and now the facing of things like the Quinault Nation is having to, move their village to higher ground. The same can be said for a community called Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, which have already most of them moved because their lands there in the bayou are flooded now. Another way that Stan Cox talks about the connections between pandemics and climate change is the ways that employers avoided COVID compliance, especially on farms. So exposing farm workers to greater risk because of the recalcitrance of employers not wanting to deal with it. And then also greater food insecurity. So COVID all increased already food insecurity for populations who are already vulnerable to that. And thinking about pandemics and environmental degradation and climate change together, he also pointed out the increased use of plastics and medical waste. And of course, you know, I don't think any of us can walk down the sidewalk and not see a disposable mask on the concrete, or see it floating in the ocean, or you know, just increased the you know, this waste. Also, he's got an analysis of air conditioning and how air conditioning increases greenhouse gases, and there's a connection to COVID spread there through aerosols, through the um, indoor exposure to these aerosols, which are contaminated with COVID. He wrote a whole book on air conditioning, which I think is really interesting. And then finally, fires. You know, of course, last year we saw the dramatic wildfire year. We saw, you know, heartbreaking images coming out of the Bay Area in San Francisco, you know, because of the wildfires that were in that region, and the people not being able to breathe because of the fine particulate matter. So, so how does that impact people in these other ways? Wildfires, you know, polluting the air and exposing to respiratory risk. The wealthy could leave, right? They could leave, they could go somewhere else because they could afford to, whereas the vulnerable could not. So they were left to face the greater exposure to particulate matter, which increased the complications for COVID. And so finally, I want to, you know, talk about what is, you know, how do we think about resilience? How do we adapt to all this? What does resilience mean in this, you know, this in climate change and a pandemic-prone world? And I think that looking at Indigenous populations is really, you know, gives us a lot of information. For one thing, American Indians, Alaska Native populations, we are the survivors of a 97% genocide. Those of us who are alive today with living connections to Native communities are the 3% that survived the settler colonial genocide that happened here in the US. And that is not an overstatement. All we have to do is do a very easy mathematical equation to understand this, how our populations collapsed and how we are today rebounding. You know, in the last century, our populations are rebounding. We're still nowhere near the population numbers that we had in 1492 when we first encountered Europeans, but we are still, we're still rebounding. And then understanding the values, these values and worldviews that shape this resilience and that shape Indigenous consciousness through Indigenous knowledge and TEK and these values of the 4 Rs. And understanding sustainability as, you know, an expanded understanding of sustainability that does not center economics. I firmly believe that this is the lesson that the world needs to hear. It needs to look to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge to understand how ethics and our relationship to land and how we live on the earth is got to be balanced with economics, so that we don't continue to have that failure of knowledge that is over reliance of a narrative of human progress based on economics. So we need to understand sustainability in much different terms, based on this kin-centric relationship to the earth, this relational orientation to the world. So how do we balance economics with these relationships to our more than human relations? And Indigenous knowledge contains those keys to understanding planetary sustainability. And I can tell you in my own work that there is a growing urgency, a growing need for this knowledge, a growing desire for this knowledge, even in the realm of science. Scientists are finally starting to listen to Native people, to understand Indigenous knowledge, and to hopefully be humbled about not thinking that they possess the highest forms of science and knowledge. That's what I think needs to be overcome, to understand that there are different systems of science that aren't necessarily inferior to theirs. So the questions would be asked, like, what are the values that will drive how we collectively imagine these solutions? And I was really heartened to see, going back to this field of planetary health, they just had their annual meeting, and their meeting was going to be in Brazil, and I think it was still mostly rooted there. I mean, they didn't meet in person, they met virtually, but there was still it was still pretty centered on through Brazilian, I don't know, it might have been a Brazilian university or something, but I was really encouraged when I saw that Robin Wall Kimmerer was their keynote speaker. And remember what I said was that a year and a half ago, when I started looking at planetary health, that field, that I saw little to no Indigenous knowledge in that literature. And so when I saw that Robin Wall Kimmerer had been invited to give the keynote, I was very, very encouraged. And of course, Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is an amazing and beautiful book that she wrote. She's a biologist that teaches at City University of New York, but she's Potawatomi, and she writes from a very Potawatomi centered perspective, and so in this keynote that she gave, she asked the question. She said that what we need, because of course she said, saying the same thing, is that Indigenous knowledge needs to be, we need to understand our relationships to the earth. And she says we need to ask, what does the earth ask of us? And she said, how we also need to ask, are we being good ancestors? So these are thinking into the future, especially this thinking about this referring to being good ancestors. This is a 7th generation worldview, how Native people have always lived their lives based on what the world will be like 7 generations into the future based on what we do now. And this is what she's referring to. So this is what does resilience looks like? It looks like clam gardens and salmon restoration in the Pacific Northwest. It looks like fish ponds in Hawaii. It looks like oyster gardens in the Pacific Northwest. It looks like returning fire to the land in California, and all kinds of other things that we can imagine. And I would like to hear about what other ways that Indigenous peoples are imagining resilience in their parts of the world. And that's what I hope this webinar, the rest of the upcoming talks that you have going on, and maybe there are people in the audience that have some something to add to that. So I'm going to stop the share now, and the screen share, and open the conversation.
Thank you so much, Kakinas. Dina, really enjoyed that. Are you able to hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you. That was really fascinating, and so many different angles to think about. We really appreciate your thoughtful words. So I want to open up the floor now to folks in the, you can put your questions in the Q&A, right, Caitlin? I believe.
Yes.
So yes, but I also wanted to especially open the floor to any of our Indigenous folks, either locally or from far away. I know there are several members of different communities here, so I'd like to welcome anyone who wants to respond with some comments or who feels comfortable sharing about how your community has either is now engaging with climate change, climate justice issues, or has responded to COVID, or anything that you'd like to bring up. And otherwise, we will move to comments in the Q&A. Let's see. I think you'll have to raise your hand. Wait, Caitlin, are we able to see if they raise their hand?
Yes, we should be able to.
Okay. All right. So if folks want to raise your hands or put a comment in the Q&A or in the chat, or I might actually shout out to Julie Maldonado if you're still here, because I don't know if she's still here. Julie, can you hear me?
Yes, I see her in attendance.
Yeah, since Dina was mentioning the community in Louisiana, I wondered if you wanted to share some comments about your experience working with folks in Louisiana. Oh. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, we're not able to hear Julie for some reason. She's unmuted, but maybe I'll give you a moment to think about that. If you want to bring anything up, please feel free. Okay, oh, now we have a couple of comments in the Q&A. Okay. So we have one person who's asking specifically about from Kauai. And the question is, specifically in Kauai, I learned the phrase malama aina, meaning to nurture the land, and in return, the land will preserve our future generations. Sometimes I feel disheartened with capitalist notions of it being too late for restoration. What are your thoughts on this?
Too late for restoration. Well, I don't think that any of us can afford to just give up, though. I mean, I think that restoration is happening. I mean, and it's going to be on regional scales. It's going to have to be, people, and it is. And this is how I see it happening in places like Hawaii with the restoration of fish ponds, the restoration of the taro patches, and other kinds of work to protect water in the islands. These are, I think that this seems to be where the literature is pointing to also, that we have to focus regionally on how we restore our particular ecosystems, because we all live in ecosystems, which means that there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. We have to do the work. We have to, there's no other option. That's what it means to be resilient, right? To know that you really don't have any options, but to just keep doing the work. And that's how you survive, like being a Native person. Like I know, growing up as a Native person, hearing all the things that I've heard my whole life about how we survived, and when it really dawns on me, even now, knowing what I know about history and knowing what I know about settler colonialism, the fact that any of us survived at all is pretty amazing. And it's that we just kept going. You just keep surviving, and you do whatever you have to do to survive. And now Now, so that was for us. Now it's going to be all of us together collectively. And that's why it's so critical that we have these conversations in these intersecting, interdisciplinary ways, and share knowledge that that we all need, and do it respectfully, because one of the risks for Native people of sharing Indigenous knowledge is that our knowledges have been abused and have been used against us, and so now we have to have that conversation too, about how do we bring in our Indigenous knowledge systems in ways that will benefit everybody but not disadvantage us. So that's kind of a loaded answer, I guess, but that's what it means to be resilient, is to not give up.
Thank you. So we have a question from Yolanel Estimo. Oh, wait. Okay. Yes.
Hi, this is Jolene. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm really excited that I got to join this and hear you today. And I just wanted to share that our family has been working for 70 years to return to our homelands. And it was based upon a statement, a vision, that my grandmother had, that, we were forcibly removed from our homelands, and that she said, we need to go back. And so we've been going back every year and having our traditional dinner, bringing all the people, the Palouse people who've been scattered all over the Northwest back there. And it is, a lot of the things that you're saying, it's a really holistic view of, using our ways to protect the area, from farming practices that are ruining the water, taking down the dams if possible, and just bringing back. A couple of years ago, we were singing some of our songs there, and my aunt stood up and interpreted the song. She said, most of the songs that we sing talk about how we're going to be healed. But this song says the land is going to be healed because the Indigenous people are here. And I just thought that was like the greatest thing ever. And so, we've just continued, and, we're not getting funded by anybody. We're just doing it as a family. So we try to encourage other people to do the same kind of cultural restoration, and to show, if we can do it, you can do it. Everybody can do it. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you. That's really important. Are you related to, so your Palouse people? I know somebody, some Eskimos that are Yakimas. So
yes, yeah.
So you're Lower Columbia people.
We're Lower Snake River.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but yeah, we're the Wauyikma band of Palouse. So there's several bands, but that's our band.
Yes, we're seeing, very similar what's happening here in California. Of course, California was the site of a very profound and recent genocide, and that has been, until recently, has been anathema to even talk about. It's been taboo to even bring it up, and it's only been in the last 2 years the governor of California actually issued a statement, acknowledging and saying the G word, that this happened here, and establishing a Truth and Healing Council. So this will be this will be the third, well, let's see, the second one that I know of in California where there's been a truth and reconciliation kind of process. But so that's that thing has station. I think we're going to see more and more of that. I just learned the other day that California has a land back policy now too. Yep, they issued a statement as part of this came from the governor's office. They issued this document. They issued this document last September. And I think if you Google on it, you can find it. I see, Annalise, I see you. I see you shaking your head and expressing, I was surprised by it too, but you know, I think more and more people are getting on board around, you know, reconciling this history, or at least, you know, some kind of accounting for it around this history, and dealing with it, and we're doing, you know, restitution work in various different ways. And, you know, of course, land back is one of those ways, and that means a lot of different things. Land back means a lot of different things.
I also want to say thank you so much, Jolene, for joining us and for sharing about your family's efforts. That's extremely, I'm very honored that you can be here. So thank you for sharing with us. We have a question coming in from Japan. We have one person joining us from Hokkaido, the lands of the Ainu people, Ainu Moshiri. We also have, let's see, Julie, are you ready to speak a little bit now? I know your children are there too. Julie Maldonado, can you hear me? Okay, maybe, oh, there you are.
Can you hear me now?
Let's try that.
Okay. Sorry, I was failing the unmute button. Yeah, sorry about that. Everyone's excited to be done with school for the week. Yeah, I think that, just really appreciate this dialogue and conversation. And I think the only thing to add was in the context of the relocation mentioned is also thinking about often, especially coming from the state, that it's often articulated as kind of either or, you know, that people are adapting in place or they're resettling, and that of looking at this as a spectrum, that even if people are having to move, that they still maintain the stewardship to their lands and waters and sacred sites and their mounds and their cemeteries and their fishing grounds and their waterways. And so what's been really unique in the Ile de Jean Charles case, in particular, are two aspects. One, in the real push to maintain that stewardship and access to their traditional ancestral lands and waters. And then also it's meant to be, intended as a resettlement plan, not only for the people still living on the island, but to bring the community back together for those who had already had to scatter. And that, unfortunately, despite what might be put out there in kind of official documents, that it's really, unfortunately become another case of the state really trampling on self-determination and a tribe's indigenous inherent sovereign rights, and which gets into, of course, issues around federal recognition and all of that. But that the resettlement was turned into, in essence, about a geographic space instead of recognizing a tribal nation. And the tribe is still advocating and fighting for their rights and for their resettlement, for the plan that they had. So the funds that got a lot of media attention around the world, those did not go to the tribe. And so I think there's a lot of kind of misconceptions about, like, as if they have the money, and so they're still very much advocating and fighting and working for what some of the tribal leadership talk about in terms of their preserving their place, while also working to resettle together as a community. And so they continue to fight for their self-determination and their inherent sovereign rights. And there was they worked collaboratively with several other tribes in Louisiana and Alaska in putting forward official complaint to the UN Special Rapporteurs. And I'll also, I can pop in the chat in a moment, a link that they've also been a collaborator on in new policy brief that a number of the communities worked on to put out too, talking about the very issues of kind of this this support that's needed at the community level, because one of the big barriers to their ability to resettle is that the policies in this country are all individual based, and there's nothing designed for the community. And so that in itself is just one small nugget that can so readily change. These aren't monumental shifts at the end of the day. Sometimes there are small wins that you can really make that could make a massive difference in this. And so I really, really appreciate how, that these issues continue to be spoken out loud and often and in as many spaces and forums as possible. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. There was another thing that happened. There's so much happening right now at the federal level with the new administration and their aims at environmental justice and to infiltrate everything that they do with environmental justice awareness and approach. And so there's the White House, it's called WEJAC, White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Of course, they issued a statement just yesterday that is sort of a preliminary working document about some of the things that they've identified that need work and how, and it's massive actually. I mean, I'm pretty impressed. I don't know, we'll see what happens, in the long run, but the ways that they're thinking through these issues. There was, and I've attended yesterday. So much is happening right now. There was a meeting of the House Natural Resources Committee with Raul Grijalva, who is the ranking member, the committee chair of that committee, and the name of it was an oversight hearing called Environmental Justice and Indigenous Peoples. And so they are, there were numerous committee members, both Republican and Democrat, engaging in this conversation. So, this is not going away. This is, I don't think it's tokenism. I don't think it's, this is a commitment to environmental justice on a scale that I don't think we've ever seen. So we have the possibility to, right now is the time to insert the kind of language, Julie, what you were saying about the kinds of things that need to be said and the different kinds of spaces that it need to be said in right now is definitely the moment to be saying it. There seems to be an opening to hearing all of this at the federal level.
That is really quite astounding and really exciting. So thank you so much for sharing that. And just to be clear, the WEJAC panel, is this the one that Dr. Kyle White has been appointed as a member of? Okay, yes. That was so exciting.
There are three Native people on that panel. Him, Jade Begay from the Indian Collective, and somebody else from Havasupai.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So I want to bring in Professor Jeff Gaiman, who works at the Hokkaido University in Hokkaido, Japan, which is a former imperial university, and I've actually spent some time there, but I know it's quite early in the morning, so thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. But he wanted to say something, speak about the Indigenous Ainu situation and land stewardship practices.
Thanks so much, Elise. And thank you, Dina, so much for the amazing talk. I've been feeling the whole time the power of a global perspective on so many different problems, and these oftentimes in Japan, in the case where they are not state recognized, there is a lot of frustration, but these examples of smaller community-based wins that we've been sharing right now are very inspiring, and here in Japan, recently, climate change has been appearing in the occurrence of more southern fishes entering into the fisheries harvest, and I believe it's bonita. Is a kind of fish.
Katsuo.
No, I'm thinking of both the Japanese name and the English name are escaping me right now, but
Okay.
a fish which we used to eat at my wife's place in Kyushu as a typical dish for the New Year's has recently entered. I mean the fisheries harvest here in Hokkaido, and there is a little bit of concern that perhaps the salmon population will no longer be maintainable. So these issues are starting to show signs of perhaps appearing here as well. But at the same time, recently local Ainu communities have been working towards restoration of forests and towards increasing participation in resources management, and also trying to network with the university. So I hope to be able to connect with more people anywhere in the world who are sharing these examples of restorative movements, Indigenous peoples' restorative movements, and activism for Indigenous rights towards their environmental resources. So it's been really inspiring to be able to participate today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I think, the networks of people connecting to each other, I see them happening all around me, and I think that you can create them. I wish that I had something that I could point to for you, like in that area. I don't know really any scholars. Well, actually I do, but I can't think of who they are, but I know that the connections are being forged everywhere, because they have to be. So, I think that, I'd be interested to know what the Ainu populations are actually doing, and, what are the possibilities for working with, like, one of the ways that one of the things that needs to happen, that is happening more and more, is working intersectionally with conservation organizations. Like that's critical. because the conservation world has been one of the worst offenders for indigenous populations over the last century and a half. There, like that needs to happen, and it's certainly happening here in the U.S. that the conservation organizations are, you know, coming to grips with their, you know, pretty terrible history, and their you know, collaboration with settler colonialism and white supremacy. So like all of that stuff has to be, it's all part of the conversation. Like there's no way that we cannot talk about all of these things all at once, as you know, Stan Cox really makes clear in his book, bringing together all these systems of domination and racial supremacy, and I would call it settler supremacy in the US. And the violence to the land, it's all related.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. I want to call on, or not call on, I want to ask Margaret McMurtry to please join us. This is like a reunion. This is so much fun.
Hi, Annalise.
Hi.
Dina, thank you for that beautiful talk. And I've admired your work, and I'm just delighted to, I know the crew that put this together, and I'm really delighted that they asked to. My name is Margaret McMurtry. On this campus, many years ago, Annalise and a bunch of undergraduate students and I started a research focus group, which has now become the American Indian and Indigenous Collective here at UCSB. And one of our goals is to establish a department here at UCSB, because we don't have one for American Indian and Indigenous Studies. And that's a whole nother topic. And we do have a minor, and we're working on a major. But what I was saying to Annalise in the chat was that we've been working with the environmental studies program here to actually expand our major, or the minor, we don't have the major yet, the minor, to include environmental studies classes. And Julie Maldonado is a member of the AIIC, and along with David Pello and Helene Gardner, have put together a list of courses that they're recommending. And I've been asked and have been teaching now, this is my second quarter of teaching TEK here at UCSB. And the exciting thing for me, I feel like I'm the facilitator. No way do I feel like the expert, and would never do that. I've invited different guest community members, as well as we have an annual symposium that we put on, and we have a guest. Not only do we bring in keynote speakers, but we also make it available to graduate students across the country to present. And those have been the most moving, I must say, and Alexander has participated with that in many ways. And so to me, the exciting opportunity, I was thinking of resilience, both by connecting TEK with environmental studies here, that the students I've had in my classes, many of them they're environmental studies majors. They've gone through 3 or 4 years of the program, and their comments are, this class has changed my life. We start with Robin Kimmerer, and then we probably, I don't know if end is appropriate. We wrap up a little bit with Dan Wildcat's book. And in between there's Devin Mishwa, and there's Kat Anderson and things, as well as their own research. But for them, having outside Indigenous knowledge keepers come and talk. So I found it really, at the beginning of the quarter, I'm like, oh no, why did I do this again? And right now, I'm just so delighted by the response of those students, because they're mostly, there's a few Native students in there, but they're mostly non-Native. And they're like, oh, I get it. Oh, everything you said was like, they're walking away with this, and to me, that's fabulous.
Yeah,
So,
I have the
thank
same
you.
experience with my TEK class. It's seems to be transformational for students, and this is it's an undergrad. It's a undergrad class. It's an upper division undergrad class. But I have had professors take my class and have it change the way that they teach. And somebody like that happened, and who is now a good friend. This woman took this class from me, who was teaching in environmental studies, and so she took the TEK class, and it blew her mind. The way that we teach our TEK class is that it's community engaged. So because we're in San Diego County has more Native American Indian reservations than any other county in the United States. Most people don't realize that. But that means that we have an amazing, resources because of the communities that we have access to. And so we take the students out onto the land, and they engage with these communities in particular themes, the way that I have the class structured. But I'm like you. I often say that I don't teach TEK, like that's not what I do. I teach them about TEK. I teach them about how other people do TEK, but I can't teach them to do TEK.
Absolutely.
And it's in it, the really the key and crucial part of it is exposing them to this very different worldview. And that will hopefully get them to change their own relationships to land.
Yeah, and
So.
I think the best way that is done, they all love Robin Kimmerer's work, and I think for them, it's the document they can share with many family members.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say, I was fortunate to be in a program down with Jolie at San Marcos that she started, I think, AIS into the 21st century. So I know the resources that you have down there in terms of local involvement. And we're fortunate, we have a very strong relationship with the Coastal Band and of the Chumash Nation in coastal areas. So, and we have members on our advisory committee that are from Coastal Band, San Ynez, and the Barbareño. So, sorry, don't mean to take up the time. Just really lovely. Thank you very much, and exciting. I think it is an exciting time. I see a lot of positive energy, and that
I do too. I do too. The last year has been remarkable. The things that I've seen and the spaces that I've been invited to, and the sheer amount of being invited into those spaces. I mean, I've given talks to groups from, legal experts to I gave a talk to a group of Washington State appellate court judges. Like, I would never in a million years have thought if I was going to get invited to address these folks. But and then groups of scientists. I gave a talk to 250 scientists several weeks ago. And other science groups. I mean, it's astounding to me. I'm just watching this unfold. Is like, there's something happening here, and I'm hearing it from other colleagues who are having similar experiences. So, it's cause for cautious optimism for me.
Agreed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I really, I'm just excited you guys got to meet because I really wanted you to be able to meet and speak to each other. So thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to ask a question that I think it's something that I agree. It's really, really important that non-native allies transform their relationships with the land and transform their way of understanding understanding the land as an entity, as a being in the world. But at the same time, I think there also needs to be a degree of, how shall we say, respect, restraint, the 5 R's, as you mentioned. And that's something that unfortunately, non-natives don't have a very good history of managing very well, as you know, to put it lightly. not to be ironic, but I think it's really important that people have an opportunity to both learn about TEK, but also do it in a way that is not, you know, occupation.
Appropriative.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I wanted to ask you about that. How can non-native allies be good allies in the direction of eventually being good ancestors to the entire land?
Yeah, that's a key question. It's something I'm working on in the new book. And, you know, because now we're talking about accountability. And how do we talk about accountability in the settler state on land that people that in a country that benefits from genocide and land theft? So how do we talk about that? I mean, we are only now being able to even have this conversation. This has been, in my view, the most taboo of all conversations to have in the US. We can talk about racial justice, you know, and, you know, especially in the last year since the uprising, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement and this new phase of environmental justice work, racial justice work that's happening. There's a new kind of a renewed energy around that. But again, that framework of justice is not broad enough to understand genocide and land theft. And so we have to have a new kind of language to talk about this. We have, and a new kind of honesty to have these conversations. And what does it mean for every individual? What does it mean to live in the homelands of somebody else that they did not cede their lands voluntarily, that were, you know, they were violently, kicked off to those? What does that mean for you to benefit from, to be the beneficiary of that? That's the conversation we need to have. And I think of a friend of mine, a friend and colleague named Giza Tonamuk, who is a Wampanoag elder. And you see him in the film Dawnland. For those of you who are familiar with that film, it was an Emmy Award-winning film a couple of years ago that looked at the truth and reconciliation process that happened in the state of Maine in 2015. The state of Maine is the only state in the US up until California's new reconciliation process. State of Maine was the only one in the US to have that. And so the film is about that. It chronicles the truth and reconciliation in Maine that looked at the taking of children through the boarding school system and the adoption system. And Giza Tonamuk is in the film talking about, because he's one of the commissioners that sat on that panel, the state appointed panel. And he talks about what it means to be neighbors with legitimacy. And I thought, and that's such a beautiful way of thinking about it too, that goes beyond, you know, guilt tripping people. Like, the goal is not to guilt people, to inflict guilt on non-native populations. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to get to, a level of honesty, yes, on the one hand, but at the same time, to think about what it means to be accountable to those populations. This is what I do with my my TEK class. That when I first the beginning of the semester, every semester when I teach it, I have the students write a short essay, and I ask them, answer the question, what is your relationship to land and place and to the indigenous peoples of that place that you call home, whatever it is? If it's your town, whatever it is that you think of as a home, what is your relationship to the land, that land and that place? Most of the time, you know, it's such an off-the-wall question. Nobody's ever, especially undergrads, right? They're not used to thinking about these things. They don't, it comes from out of left field for them. And so so they answer it, and then you know, and their answers are pretty predictable. And then I asked them to rewrite the essay at the end of the semester. I asked them, now I want you to tell me, and now that you've been, you know, immersed in Indigenous knowledge for 16 weeks, has your has your relationship to land and place changed at all in your mind? And if so, how? And if not, why not? And I'm documenting this. This is a research project for me. And so far the statistics are that 87% of them note significant change in their perspective after learning about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldviews and the 4 R's and all of that stuff. They say very profound things and very mean, like it shifts their thinking. So I know I have anecdotal evidence that tells me that when people are exposed to a new way of thinking that goes beyond the extractive capitalist you know, model, that they are capable of embracing it. And you know, this is again, this is a relational way of being. I think that you can be non-Indigenous to a place and still have an ethical relationship to it. And I think that's the goal. This is like, you know, settler people cannot be Indigenous. Like that's like that cannot happen. Like that'll never happen. But you can be neighbors with legitimacy on the land in a relational, ethical way.
Thank you. I feel like that's a really strong place for us to sort of wrap up, because I think we all need to really think a lot about what that means and what needs to shift for us to enable that to happen. Did any of our fellow panelists, do any of the grad students, did you have any questions you wanted to ask? Okay. Okay, and Jeff.
It's not a question. Personally, I come from a background in education and have been structuring my courses on to the undergrads at Hokkaido University from the point of view of Indigenous peoples and education, and it's very uplifting to see commonalities in Dina, the way that you have been approaching your courses, and sorry, was it Margaret? The way that she has been approaching her courses, and I think that it points out the need for interdisciplinarity in scholarship and research, and for us people working in universities to be, for that to be our mantra in our teaching, research, and activism work. So I'm definitely interested in keeping up getting a conversation and keeping up a conversation going with regards to that. It's been really inspiring to participate today.
Thanks. Well, you're welcome to stay in touch with me. I guess I can give my, for anybody who wants to reach out, my email address is dinagwhitaker@gmail.com. I'll put that in the chat. Just oh, I can't send it to everyone though. Oh, I can.
Caitlin just did.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Got it.
And I think Alexander has a question or a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Dina, for sharing. It's been an amazing experience, and I wanted to ask if you could talk a bit about your experience as a professor teaching, particularly you were mentioning bringing your students in your TEK class out to reservation lands, to Indigenous communities. And I know one thing that can come up in the spaces of universities and institutions is a history and ongoing, like, visceral sense of mistrust that can exist in Native communities towards the institution. Yeah, and this is a very alive thing. And so, I just wonder, I would love to hear you talk more about your experience working with different reservation communities and bringing your classes there, and how you see students interacting with community members there, and how what kind of role you understand yourself to be playing in bringing those communities together.
Hmm. I would say that my experience has been nothing but positive. I have not had any kind of negative impact. Nothing. I mean, it's all the students seem to, they like it so much. They get a different perspective, um, one that it shifts their thinking, and um, they seem to really appreciate it. And as far as the community members, they are nothing but eager to share their knowledge and to share their experience, and to, in an educational kind of setting like that, they are partners with us. So we part as a university. My connections to them come through. I mean, and I'm an outsider. I'm native, but I'm not a native Californian. So I consider myself, I'm a guest in their homeland. So, and that brings up another thing about my own set of ethics, my own values, and how I perceive myself as someone who is a guest in other people's homelands. Like this is, I embody that. All the things that I say to people about accountability and about being on land, being, that's gotten through genocide and land theft. I'm one of those people. I'm not living in my homelands. And so, I apply those principles to myself, and because I don't want to be a hypocrite about it. So what are my accountabilities? So this is what it, like, how do we account for all of this? And and that's starting from a humble place. And that's, I guess that's part of what I'm trying to convey to the students is that kind of that humbleness, that humility. And I think that they're already, they don't know anything already. They're like babies. They don't know this stuff. They're exposed to a conversation they didn't even know existed. So it's all pretty good. It's been wonderful. It's my favorite course to teach by far, and it's just so rich. And yeah, I feel very honored that I get to teach it.
Amazing. Thank you.
Sorry. We have a we have a comment from Joan Andick. I think someone that you know.
Mm-hmm. There's
Yes.
a number of people in the list that are friends of mine. I'm happy to say.
Yes, Joan, would you like to just share what you just wrote in the chat, or in the Q&A, excuse me? Are you still there? Can you hear us? I'm not sure if Joan is hearing us. Okay. Okay, so in the Q&A, Joan has just written, we are working on shifting the education system. Joan is unable to unmute. Caitlin, can you unmute Joan, please?
Yeah, I've hit the please unmute button, but
Let's see, ask to unmute.
that's about all I can do on my end.
Okay. Joan, can you try clicking the mic icon in the corner of your screen? Trying to unmute, Joan.
I will hit mute and then unmute again. See if that works.
Okay, see if that works. Uh-oh. Huh.
Okay, how about now?
Okay.
I guess Zoom is not infallible.
No, sometimes there are issues. So I'll just go ahead and read what Joan has written. We are working on shifting the education system to center the epistemologies of Indigenous, Black, and other peoples who have been marginalized in the settler colonial system. And then Joan writes, hi, Dina.
Hi, Joan.
I wish we could hear you directly. Okay, we have one final question that sort of puts capitalism in direct conversation with cooperatives. So this is an anonymous attendee who says, what are your thoughts about the the co-op movement in addressing the issue of unfettered capitalism?
Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly that's referring to. I mean, the co-op movement, I mean, it's not a new model, right? I mean, co-ops, I think of food co-ops, and other kinds of co-ops, and there's other kinds of cooperative ways of organizing. I'm thinking about especially things like land conservancies and land trusts. I think these are maybe forms of co-ops, maybe. I don't know, maybe maybe some people would not agree with that, but the co-op movement sort of writ large, that really emphasizes collaborative, cooperative partnerships, shared governance and things like that. And I think that, it's one answer to the capitalist state. Like it's, short of maybe it's one method of skirting around or maybe dismantling the capitalist state. I think of cooperative, business models where employees own the companies, those kinds of things. I think that these are really viable ways to diss capitalism, which is really what we have to do. In terms of land, that the land trusts and the land conservancies and things like that are ways that Indigenous peoples, when there are no other options to them because of the structures of the settler state, through regimes of federal recognition and things like that, tribal recognition, they turn to these other kinds of tools. And I would say the same that also includes community rights, the community rights movement, and also the rights of nature movement, and and personhood movement. These are all responses or actions that sidestep that are necessary because of the limitations of capitalism. So so they're absolutely necessary in all these ways that we can imagine.
Yes, absolutely. There's, like I just so much sort of wonderful ideas and approaches for all of us to start really thinking about and incorporating into our relationships with the communities and the places where each of us live. And And I feel like there's a lot, obviously there's, infinitely more that we could discuss, so many really fruitful directions that we could pursue today. Certainly around the issue of COVID and pandemics and the incredible creative responses, really sort of just drawing from a whole range of different ancestral teachings and present day practices and living on the land and care for the body and the mind, all of the work that different communities have been doing. Oh, so sorry, I was just about to wrap up, but I wanted to just offer the space to Anupam Kaur, who is in Jadugoda, and he has been working for about 5 years or more, supporting the indigenous Ho and the Munda and the Oraon and the Santal indigenous Adivasi communities who are fighting a really brutal uranium mining project. So Anupam, do you want to say a couple words about your experiences? Toda boliye?
Yes.
Dhanyawad.
So, hello everyone. My English was not good, but I can try.
Okay, toda. ठीक है जी.
Thoda, yes. So, yeah, maybe means here I'm working from here for my group, Johar Jharkhandi Organization Radiation Against. I'm working of them 10 years.
Oh, 10 years.
Yes. So we are not here the indigenous people. Absolutely, I know the indigenous people here. They are working very hard for them, the indigenous.
Yes.
So I can tell you in Hindi for some.
Okay.
Please translate them.
Okay, I'll try.
Yes. यहाँ के जो लोग हैं
जी.
यहाँ के जो लोग हैं हम जो हमारे यहाँ के हमारे ग्रुप में सब लोग साथ देते हैं एक दूसरे के.
Okay, so I work with he himself is not indigenous, but he works with the indigenous community members who are part of this Jharkhandi organization against radiation here in a village or city called Jadugoda, and and the people are very angry about the ways that the uranium mining, which has been going on for 50 years, has interrupted their life.
Yes. And यहाँ के जो लोग हैं वो अपने कल्चर को सबसे ज्यादा मानते हैं.
जी.
पेड़ों को पूजा करते हैं. जो यहाँ के जंगल है उनको पूजा करते हैं और उनको तबाह नहीं करते हैं. उनको काटते नहीं, उनको मना किया जाता है. जो अगले लोग दूसरे लोग जो होते हैं उनको काटते हैं.
Okay.
understand?
Only a little bit. So he's saying that we've been doing, we're at the limit of my Hindi ability. So he's saying that we've been doing a lot of work, cultural work to support the Adivasi community, but also giving offerings through puja, है ना? Doing offerings and trying to improve the relations with the land by giving the puja offerings to the sacred site, which is called Jairtan in the local indigenous language. And so they are trying to restore. He was listening to your presentation. He's saying that they're working very hard to restore those relations with the landscape, with the local indigenous, restore the indigenous relations by giving these offerings at the Jairtan, the local
Yes.
Jairtan, which are all around the mines. They're actually interspersed in the villages near the mines and near the tailing dams. जी,
Yes.
थोड़ा बोलिए.
जी. And so उसके बाद जो है यहाँ का जो माइनिंग शुरू हुआ वो तो मैं नहीं बता पाऊंगा.
Okay.
When is start in the mining here, and so what can I tell you? Or
Okay.
मैं क्या बता पाऊँ?
maybe enough, because I don't think I'm going to be able to translate, and we should probably
Yes,
wrap
yes,
up.
yes.
But
Yes, yes.
but after doing this work, the mining is continuing, but they have benefited from being able to get, so they have had some small victories along the way, even though the mining is continuing.
Yes.
And they have helped bring some small amount of justice to the people, better working conditions, forcing the trucks to cover the loads. Before they would just drive through the village and drop the uranium rocks on the side of the road. They've
Yes,
also
yes.
demanded that the company is now supplying piped in, has built shower blocks and supplying fresh water that's not contaminated to the villages that are the closest by. But still, many of the people are still suffering from the impacts of having the tailing
Yes.
dams, like within 50 meters of the communities. So it's very close by to where they're
Yes,
living.
I've heard of some of those uranium problems in India, and I would say that, of course, I don't know if Anupam knows this, but we have our own history here in the United States with uranium mining, and even though the uranium mines have been closed for several decades, they still continue to pollute the land and contaminate the bodies of indigenous peoples, of course, disproportionately. And I, maybe he already knows this, but I would encourage the people there in India to look at the example and to study it, just to study it.
Gee, so Anupam, I can tell you more about what she's saying later, but
Yes, yes.
I would just say in response that not Anupam himself, but his very good friend, Ashish Birli and Ashish Birli's father, they've actually attended the uranium mining summit with the Navajo community about 10 years ago. I don't remember exactly when, but so they already have been networking and are part of that global alliance of indigenous communities fighting against the devastation from the mining. And so that's been a huge source of empowerment. And Ashish wanted to join us today, but he might still be asleep because it's 6 in the morning, 6 a.m. in India. But thank you, Anupam, and I'll follow up with you later and we can continue this conversation.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Shukriya ji, BTM.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. And I know that we've had a lot of fruitful discussions in the chat. We will, I just want to make sure everyone knows that we are recording and we will post the recording on the website for the webinar series. We will also send that reminder out to everyone when that has been completed. And if folks want to stay in touch with one another, please go ahead and send us a quick message in the chat, or you can email me and we can put people together, or sorry, not together, put people in touch with one another after the webinar, this webinar is complete. But I just want to say a huge Yairai Kire BTM and Kakinas to Dina for sharing, for bringing us all together and really helping us kind of integrate what I think a lot of us know to be huge, gigantic, wicked problems that we deal with, but we didn't have the tools or the sort of perspective to begin knitting them together in the way that they already are. and really trying to understand those linkages. We have to understand the histories in order to understand the present, place where we sit, in order to understand that the land is the base, the sort of living relation which is connected to all of this. And until we sort of get those connections, then it's very hard for us to change our actions and our life ways to do anything about it. So huge gratitude
Absolutely.
to you. And
well, thank you
so much.
so much. And thanks for organizing it. And I'm deeply grateful for the invitation and to have this amazing conversation, to connect with all of you. And thank you so much for your attention, and feel free to reach out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great.